Hey there, friends and enemies, Jopi here again, and yesterday we got the initial reveal trailer for the Blood of Dawnwalker, an upcoming single-player, third-person dark fantasy action RPG, which looks very interesting and will heavily involve vampires in the story. This game has a full gameplay reveal slated to come in summer 2025, which I'm really looking forward to as well, because while we got some cinematics and an overview of the story, we didn't get a lot of gameplay, and that is what I think will indicate how much excitement there actually is for the game. As far as the details we got today, there's a lot of interesting tidbits to take from it. So it's focused on a narrative sandbox. No two playthroughs should be identical. This is something you hear from games a lot, and hopefully it lives up to that being the case, because replayability with single player games is something that will keep them fresh. You look at the Cyberpunk 2077 Steam numbers right now, they're still very high, which is unusual for a single player game. So having that level of replayability will be very interesting. Now, as far as some other things to keep in note, takes place in Vale Sangora in 14th century medieval Europe. Obviously, with vampires, it's not going to be completely historically accurate, so keep that in mind. Setting has been ravaged by the plague, famine, and social disorder. Inspired by Eastern European architecture and culture, Polish log houses, Ukrainian and Balkan clothing, Romanian defensive churches, and more. The world has been watched by vampires in the shadows, waiting to strike and make their move when humanity is at its lowest and to overthrow the feudal lords. So vampires, like I mentioned, will be heavily involved. I'd imagine there's a kind of tough dynamic with the humans interacting with the vampires, each struggling for power in their own right, and your main character deciding which path to choose. I hope that is a choice that is heavily involved as you kind of decide between humanity and the vampirism. So the day-night cycle plays a big role. Wanted the world and villages and buildings to feel like a different place after sunset. This is something that could work out very well, but could also be a bit of an issue if you are trying to lean heavily into one side or another. Obviously, during the day, more human interactions, I would imagine, whereas at night, you'll have more vampires to deal with. You play as Cohen, energetic, becomes a Dawnwalker who's not human, not vampire, something in between. This was kind of indicated in the trailer, and it does look like you're going to be kind of walking that line, similar to Blade from Marvel, for example. And you can traverse between both worlds of humanity and creatures of the night. And this is where it'll be fascinating to see if one or the other is more intriguing or interesting. Then you're going to want to spend more time in day or night, and depending on how that actually works, it might make that a bit more difficult. So I do wonder how they're going to balance the two in the long run. You fight with swords and weapons by day. You can use vampire abilities in combat at night, explore the environment, etc. So it does look like your vampire abilities will be restricted, and how they make combat interesting during the day is another thing that's going to be very, very fascinating. We saw a bit of magic in the trailer so far, but that's from a vampire. So if you only get to use the vampire magic at night, that could be a bit of an issue. But we also know that the developers who are working on this game have history with games like The Witcher, so maybe they find a way to use magic as humans as well, which I think would be very, very important when it comes to keeping the day cycle as interesting as the night cycle, because you don't want it to be so much focused on the vampire abilities that the day cycle feels a little bit more boring. You have 30 in-game days and 30 nights to save your family. They wanted a sense of urgency. When you complete an objective, quest time moves forward, but time doesn't pass in real-world time. You manage how you use time as a resource. This is something I recently experienced with Metaphor Refantasio in that RPG. So it's not an unfamiliar mechanic, but you just have to make sure there's enough time to do as much as possible in those 30 days and nights. Obviously, if you spend an hour in each, that would be a 60-hour game. So there is potential for it to be a long, involved game as well, which I think is interesting. But it just depends on how travel works, how much time travel takes up for your day and night cycle, how big the world is overall, how much you can do, how many quests you can do within a day or night cycle. So I do feel like there is, especially when it comes to side quests. So I do think that's a fine line to walk, but it could work very well and could be a way to separate this game from a lot of other games in this genre if they do it correctly. So I am cautiously optimistic on how they're going to handle that. You'll meet many characters throughout the game with their own goals and ambitions, which may make your friends or put you in opposition to them. So I do feel like this is, again, similar to a game like The Witcher, where you have decisions to make with various characters, whether they are romantic or just purely based on what decisions you want to make at the end of every quest in order to shape the world around you. And if they do that in a way that makes a lot of sense, then it could be very, very good, as I mentioned. But again, scale matters, and how well they write the characters will tell how important that all ends up being ultimately at the end of the day. There's a blood hunger mechanic where you need to feed throughout your playthrough. If you talk to someone and have gone long without feeding first, you might lose control and eat them, even your best friend in the game, which would be hilarious, honestly, for me. But I do think that could be potentially frustrating. So how it's implemented, again, we'll have to wait and see. I'm excited about the gameplay in the summer because I think that'll tell us a lot more about what to expect from this mechanic and how it's going to play into the game ultimately. Vampire design. In the world, vampires' teeth don't stop growing, so the older vampires have a lot of teeth, aren't visible at first, but they can extend their mouth, as we saw in the trailer. Vampires are led by Brankus, a super powerful old vampire that wants to change the world, twisted old religious beliefs, and took advantage of social turmoil to turn himself into sort of a messianic figure. Vampire leadership aren't black and white, but more gray. This is what I mentioned when reacting to the trailer. I do hope that ultimately the storyline is more gray and you have some options to be kind of good, kind of bad, somewhere in between, maybe an anti-hero of sorts at times. I think that would be the most interesting way to play a game of this nature. The vampires overthrew violent and corrupt feudal lords, but also kill people to eat, conduct blood massacres or masses at church, etc. Brankus will be sort of an active antagonist that will react to your actions and decisions. Will set edicts in the game that will become obstacles to the player, like military checkpoints, etc. Again, all of that, how the world reacts to you, how you are able to shape it, will be the most fascinating thing to me personally in how they ultimately have this game feel alive. And that is what makes an RPG very fun. And yeah, ultimately, all good information, but once again, we'll have to wait and see more. I'm just glad we're getting a lot of this with the initial reveal, so it feels like a fully fleshed out game and not a sampler like we get. Sometimes we'll get a teaser and then we'll have to wait years and years before we get additional information about the game, but this seems like there's a lot to look forward to. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Like the video, as always, comment, subscribe. Have a good one, and I'll catch you all later.